The fluorescent lights in the headquarters buzzed with their usual artificial hum as I made my way through the sterile corridors of our Washington, D.C. facility. 15 years of field operations had taught me to read the atmosphere of a situation, and something felt different that Thursday morning. The usual bureaucratic drone of keyboard clicks and hushed conversations was replaced by an unsettling silence. My watch showed 7:45 a.m. when Director Thompson's secretary intercepted me before I could reach my desk. Her typically composed demeanor showed cracks of concern as she gestured toward the briefing room. "They've been waiting for you," she whispered, her voice carrying an edge I'd never heard before. The briefing room felt colder than usual. Director Thompson stood at the head of the table, his face illuminated by the harsh glow of multiple screens. I'd known Thompson for 12 years, seen him handle everything from terrorist threats to potential nuclear crises, but the gray pallor of his face sent a chill down my spine. "Agent Brooks," he began, not bothering with our usual pleasantries. "What I'm about to show you doesn't leave this room." His fingers danced across the tablet in his hands, and the screens behind him flickered to life. The footage was grainy, security camera quality, showing what appeared to be a research facility. The timestamp in the corner showed it was from 3 days ago. The image showed a long corridor, presumably somewhere in the facility. A figure stumbled into frame, moving in a way that made my stomach turn. Their movements were wrong, jerky and unnatural, like a puppet being manipulated by an inexperienced handler. Behind them, something dark stained the white walls. "This is the last transmission we received from our facility in Alaska," Thompson explained, his voice tight. "We've lost contact with 4 teams already." He paused the footage, zooming in on the figure. The image quality was poor, but I could see enough to know that whatever was wrong with them wasn't a simple injury. Thompson swiped through a series of satellite images showing the facility's location. It sat isolated in the Alaskan wilderness, surrounded by nothing but snow and mountains for hundreds of miles. The facility was established under the guise of climate research, he continued. "The reality is more complicated." He pulled up another file, this one showing atmospheric readings from around the facility. The numbers made no sense. Temperature fluctuations that shouldn't be possible, radiation levels that seemed to pulse in patterns that defied natural law. "We lost contact with the facility director, Dr. Anderson, shortly after receiving this footage. The last transmission we received." Thompson trailed off, something I'd never seen him do before. The next video he played made me wish he hadn't shown it at all. The camera showed what appeared to be a laboratory. Blood covered most of the lens, but through the crimson streaks I could make out shapes moving in ways that human bodies shouldn't be capable of. In the background, screams mixed with sounds that couldn't have come from human vocal cords. "You have 4 hours to prepare," Thompson said, shutting off the screens. "We need our best operative on this, and that's you. Your pilot will be ready at 12 p.m. sharp." He slid a thick file across the table. "Everything we know is in here, but be warned, our intel is severely limited. The last team that made it inside reported that the facility's infrastructure is still operational, running on emergency power. They also mentioned," he hesitated again, "biological anomalies." I opened the file, and my eyes immediately locked onto a photograph that made my blood run cold. It showed what had once been a human hand, but the flesh had twisted and transformed into something else entirely. The fingers had elongated to nearly twice their normal length, and the skin had taken on a texture that reminded me of bark. "Your primary objective is to reach the facility's central database and retrieve all research data," Thompson continued. "Secondary objective is to locate any survivors, though at this point, he didn't need to finish the sentence. The implications were clear in the footage we'd seen. The next few hours passed in a blur of preparation. I familiarized myself with the facility's layout, memorizing evacuation routes and security protocols. The satellite imagery showed recent snowfall had nearly buried the external access points, but the main entrance was reportedly still accessible. I carefully selected my gear, opting for a balance between mobility and protection. Standard issue weapons felt inadequate given what I'd seen in the footage, but they were all I had. Thompson had authorized me to carry enough ammunition to start a small war, along with specialized cold weather gear and emergency supplies. As I boarded the helicopter at precisely 12 p.m., Thompson pulled me aside for one final word. "Brooks," he said, gripping my arm with unusual intensity, "if you see anything that doesn't make sense, anything that shouldn't be possible, retreat immediately. We've already lost too many good people to whatever is happening up there." The helicopter lifted off into a clear, winter sky, but as we headed north, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was heading towards something that would change everything I thought I knew about reality. The file sat heavy in my lap, filled with reports of impossible things, and somewhere in the vast whiteness of Alaska, something waited that had already claimed 4 teams of our best operatives. Little did I know, this was only the beginning of a nightmare that would challenge not just my survival skills, but my very understanding of what it means to be human. He was right. The storm system seemed to circle the facility's coordinates, like water spiraling down a drain. As we approached, the helicopter's instruments began to behave erratically. The compass spun wildly, and the altimeter jumped between readings that were impossible given our flight path. 2 miles out, Reynolds announced, his knuckles white against the controls, visibility dropping rapidly. Through the windshield, fat snowflakes whipped past us with increasing fury. The weather report had predicted clear conditions, but nature seemed to have other plans. The facility emerged from the whiteout like a ghost ship materializing from fog. Its dark silhouette stood in stark contrast to the endless expanse of snow, a complex of interconnected buildings that sprawled across the tundra. The landing pad was barely visible, marked only by the dim glow of emergency lights that pulsed with an unsettling rhythm. As we descended, I noticed the first sign that something was terribly wrong. The facility's perimeter fence had been breached in multiple locations, not by external force but from within. Metal poles were bent outward, like something had exploded from the compound with tremendous force. Reynolds set us down with professional precision, but I could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold. "I don't like this," he said, scanning the surroundings. "The air, it feels heavy, wrong." He wasn't being paranoid. Even through my cold weather gear, I could feel an unusual pressure against my skin, like the atmosphere itself was pressing in around us. "Keep the engine running," I instructed, checking my equipment one final time. "If I'm not back in 48 hours, follow emergency protocol Delta." We both knew what that meant. No rescue attempt, just a direct flight back to headquarters and immediate quarantine procedures. The moment I stepped onto the landing pad, the full impact of the isolation hit me. The facility was a tiny speck of human presence in an endless white void. The wind howled through the damaged structures, creating eerie whistles and moans that sounded disturbingly like distant voices. 20 yards from the helicopter, I found the first body. The snow had partially buried it, but enough remained visible to make me grateful for my strong stomach. The corpse wore the uniform of facility security, but the body inside that uniform had changed. The arms had elongated, joints bulging and multiplying in ways that defied anatomy. The flesh had taken on a mottled, almost iridescent quality like oil on water. The face was the worst part. The jaw had split and reformed into something that resembled a flower made of teeth, frozen mid-bloom in the Arctic cold. What struck me most wasn't the grotesque transformation, but the expression still visible in the human eyes, a mixture of terror and ecstasy that haunted me. I approached the main entrance, noting the lack of signs announcing the facility's supposed climate research purpose. The security checkpoint was unmanned, its reinforced glass shattered. Blood trails led in multiple directions, some defying gravity by crawling up walls and across ceilings. The patterns they formed seemed almost deliberate, like a twisted form of art. The entry airlock cycled with a hiss that seemed too loud in the oppressive silence. Emergency lighting cast everything in a sickly red glow, creating shadows that seemed to move when viewed from the corner of my eye. The temperature inside was significantly higher than it should have been given the failing systems, and the air had a thick, organic quality that made each breath feel like drowning. My footsteps echoed through the corridors, accompanied by the subtle crunch of broken glass and the squish of something less identifiable beneath my boots. The walls were wrong. What should have been sterile white surfaces were marred by strange growths that pulsed with bioluminescence. They followed the electrical conduits like veins, spreading out in patterns that reminded me of neural networks. The first floor security station was a scene of violence that told a story I struggled to comprehend. The reinforced door had been torn open from both sides, the metal peeled back like flower petals. Inside, monitors still flickered with static-filled images from the few cameras that remained operational. One screen showed a live feed from a lower level, and as I watched, a shadow passed in front of the lens, something massive that moved with a fluidity that nothing that size should possess. I checked my tablet, pulling up the facility schematics. The central database was located 3 floors below, past the main research labs. According to the emergency systems diagnostic, that section was still powered, but the route there would take me through areas marked by ominous static in our surveillance data. A sound echoed through the ventilation system, a long, keening wail that could have been the wind, if wind could carry the weight of human suffering in its voice. I switched on my body camera, speaking quietly into the microphone. Initial facility assessment shows signs of catastrophic containment failure, evidence of extreme biological contamination, and I paused as another sound reached me, closer this time. Multiple casualties with signs of severe physiological mutations. Proceeding to lower levels to access central database. The elevator was out of the question, both because of the questionable power situation and because sealed metal boxes are death traps in scenarios like this. I located the emergency stairwell, noting with growing unease that the bioluminescent growths were thicker here, pulsing in sync with a rhythm I could feel in my bones. As I began my descent into the facility's depths, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, not from any particular direction, but from everywhere at once, as if the facility itself had developed a malevolent consciousness. The deeper I went, the stronger that sensation became, along with a new awareness that made my skin crawl. The air was getting warmer, and the walls seemed to be breathing. The stairwell ended at a heavy security door marked Medical Wing, Level B2. The electronic lock was fried, but someone had wedged the door open with what looked like a human femur. The bone had changed, grown crystalline structures that anchored it firmly in place. I tried not to think about whether its owner had been alive when it was removed. As I entered the medical wing, my radio crackled to life with a burst of static that formed patterns almost like words. Through the interference, I caught fragments of what sounded like counting, but the numbers made no sense. Sequences that seemed to fold in on themselves in impossible ways. The medical wing had been converted into a makeshift fortress. Beds and equipment were welded together to form barriers, and the walls were covered in hastily scrawled warnings. Most were typical quarantine notices, but others were more disturbing. "It gets in your dreams," and "Don't trust your eyes" stood out in red letters that might have been paint or something else entirely. Movement behind one of the barriers caught my attention. "Federal agent," I announced, keeping my weapon ready. "I'm here to help." A figure slowly rose from behind the barricade. He wore a lab coat so stained with various fluids that its original color was just a memory. "You shouldn't have come," he said, his voice raw. "But since you're here, you might as well meet what's left of us." He introduced himself as Dr. Anderson, the facility director Thompson had mentioned. Something about his movements seemed off, too precise, like each gesture was carefully calculated. His eyes never quite focused on me, always looking slightly to my left or right. Anderson led me to what had once been the intensive care unit. 6 survivors huddled there, surrounded by medical equipment jury-rigged into makeshift monitoring devices. Their faces showed the 1,000-yard stares of people who had seen things they could never unsee. "We're all infected," Anderson stated matter-of-factly, rolling up his sleeve to reveal dark lines spreading beneath his skin in patterns that reminded me of circuit boards. "It's just a question of how long, until we turn. Some fight it longer than others. Some embrace it. A woman in a torn security uniform spoke up, her voice barely above a whisper. "It started with the nosebleeds. We thought it was just the pressure changes from the weather system." She touched her nose unconsciously, and I noticed dried blood caked around her nostrils. Then people started changing. Not just physically, their minds changed too. They began to understand things they shouldn't be able to understand. "Show them," Anderson commanded, and one of the survivors pulled out a tablet. The screen displayed a series of images that made my head hurt to look at, biological structures that seemed to exist in more dimensions than should be possible. "We thought we were so clever," Anderson continued, pacing with that unsettling precision. "We found something in the ice, something that had been waiting for millions of years. The agency wanted us to weaponize it, but we didn't understand what we were dealing with. It wasn't just a virus or a biological agent. It was intelligent, ancient, patient." A loud bang echoed from somewhere deeper in the facility, followed by a sound that could have been laughter or screaming. Everyone tensed, and I noticed how they moved in perfect unison, like a single organism controlling multiple bodies. "The others will have heard that," Anderson said. "The ones who turned first. They're different now, more complete." He smiled, and for a moment I saw too many teeth in his mouth. "They want to share what they've learned, to help everyone else evolve. Such generous creatures." One of the survivors, a young man who'd been quietly rocking in the corner, suddenly stood. Blood poured from his nose and ears as he spoke in a voice that resonated oddly in my chest. "They're coming. They can smell the new meat." The lights flickered, and in that moment of darkness, I saw Anderson's true form reflected in a nearby window. His shadow wasn't human anymore. When the lights stabilized, he looked normal again, but now I could see what I'd been missing. The way his joints bent slightly wrong, the occasional ripple under his skin like something trying to break free. "You want to know what happened here?" Anderson's voice had changed, gaining harmonics that made my teeth vibrate. "Let me show you our research logs. You should understand what you're about to become part of." He led me to a computer terminal, his movements becoming increasingly fluid, almost serpentine. As he pulled up the files, I noticed his fingers had begun to fuse together, the skin between them stretching and becoming translucent. The screen filled with data that told a story of hubris and horror, detailed accounts of the first experiments, the initial successes that had doomed them all. The agency found the samples during a classified Antarctic expedition, Anderson explained, his excitement growing visibly as strange shapes moved beneath his skin. "But the cold there was too intense for proper testing. Here in Alaska, we found the perfect balance, cold enough to keep it stable, but warm enough to allow it to thrive." The young man who'd spoken earlier suddenly screamed, his back arching at an impossible angle. We all watched in horrified fascination as his skin began to ripple and shift. "It's beautiful," Anderson whispered, tears of blood running down his face. "The next stage of human evolution. We're all going to be so perfect." That's when the power went out, plunging us into darkness, broken only by the bioluminescent growths and the growing number of eyes opening in Anderson's rapidly transforming face. When emergency power restored partial lighting 40 seconds later, I found myself alone in the medical wing. The survivors had vanished, leaving behind only smears of blood and strange, iridescent fluid that seemed to move on its own. Anderson's last human scream echoed through the corridors, transforming mid-sound into something that made my ears bleed. I had to reach the lower levels. Whatever was happening here, the answers lay in the original research data. My tactical flashlight revealed that the bioluminescent growths had spread during the blackout, now forming complex patterns that pulsed in synchronization with my heartbeat. The sensation of being watched had intensified, not just watched, but studied, analyzed by something vast and alien. The stairwell to the lower laboratories had collapsed, forcing me to find another route. Facility maps showed maintenance tunnels running parallel to the main corridors, accessible through a nearby storage room. As I approached, my head began to throb. At first, I attributed it to stress and the strange atmospheric pressure, but then I noticed blood on my glove after wiping my nose. The storage room door had been torn apart from the inside, its reinforced steel warped and twisted by forces I couldn't comprehend. Inside, shelves of supplies had been arranged in a spiral pattern around a central point where the floor had changed. The concrete had become organic, developing textures and patterns that seemed to shift when viewed directly. I found the maintenance access hatch, but opening it required me to step onto that transformed floor. The surface yielded slightly beneath my boots, and I swore I felt it pulse. As I pulled the hatch open, a wave of hot, humid air washed over me, carrying the scent of decay and something else, something sweet and metallic that made my mouth water involuntarily. The maintenance tunnel stretched into darkness. My flashlight beam revealed pipes and conduits along the walls, but they'd been overtaken by growth that looked like a cross between fungus and circuitry. As I moved deeper, I began to hear whispers, not through my radio, but directly in my mind. Fragments of thoughts that weren't my own, memories I'd never experienced. I saw flashes of the early experiments, scientists in protective gear examining something they'd extracted from deep ice cores. The first subject's transformation, not a failure as they'd initially thought, but a successful metamorphosis into something new. The subsequent tests, each revealing more about the infection's true nature. The growing realization that it wasn't just changing bodies, but rebuilding them according to some alien blueprint. A noise ahead snapped me back to reality. One of the transformed facility staff moved through an intersection of tunnels. In the brief glimpse I caught, I saw that their body had adapted to the tunnel environment, becoming long and sinuous. Multiple limbs propelled them along the walls and ceiling with terrible grace. They passed without noticing me, but I heard them singing softly, complex harmonies that no human vocal cords could produce. The tunnel ended at a massive chamber that had been hollowed out beneath the facility. This wasn't on any of the maps I'd studied. The walls were covered in biological processors, hybrid organs that pulsed with electrical activity. Scattered throughout the room, containment pods held partially transformed subjects suspended in luminescent fluid. Their mutations seemed to follow patterns, each one a deliberate step toward some ultimate form. In the center of the chamber, I found Dr. Anderson's laptop, still functional. The screen displayed his final log entry, dated just hours before my arrival. The agency never understood what they had found. They thought they could control it, weaponize it, but the infection isn't a weapon, it's a gift. The entities that created it seeded similar samples across countless worlds, waiting for species advanced enough to find them. It doesn't just change us, it improves us, elevates us. Every person it transforms adds their knowledge, their memories, their essence to the collective. We're becoming something glorious. My hands trembled as I downloaded the data. The infection had reached deeper into the facility than anyone had guessed. The biological computers weren't just monitoring the transformations. They were guiding them, working towards some grand design. And now I could feel it working inside me, restructuring my thoughts, showing me possibilities I'd never imagined. A door at the far end of the chamber opened, revealing a laboratory filled with strange equipment. Inside, I found video logs from the previous investigation teams. Their footage showed the progression of their own transformations, recorded with clinical detachment even as their bodies and minds underwent radical changes. The last entry showed them willingly entering large organic pods that had grown from the facility's walls. My nose was bleeding freely now, and I could feel pressure building behind my eyes. When I looked at my reflection in a darkened monitor, I saw something moving beneath my skin. But what terrified me most was my own reaction, not horror, but curiosity. Part of me wanted to understand these changes, to experience them fully. That's when I heard them, hundreds of footsteps approaching from all directions. The transformed facility staff, moving with perfect coordination, and leading them was Anderson, his body now a masterpiece of biological engineering, an impossible fusion of human and something far beyond our understanding. "Welcome," they said in unison, their voices harmonizing in ways that made reality shiver. "We've been waiting for you to join us." Their voices resonated through my skull, a symphony of impossible harmonics that made reality blur around the edges. I backed away from Anderson, or what Anderson had become, my training warring with instincts that no longer felt entirely human. The thing that had been the facility director towered over me, its form constantly shifting between states of matter I couldn't comprehend. The agency knew, the collective voice continued. They've known for decades. This facility isn't the first. We're simply the most successful. Anderson's primary mouth smiled, revealing rows of crystalline teeth that refracted light in hypnotic patterns. Would you like to see the truth? We can show you everything. Before I could react, tendrils of bioluminescent tissue erupted from the walls, connecting to the neural ports that had formed at the base of Anderson's spine. The organic computers surged with activity, and suddenly the room filled with holographic displays. But these weren't generated by technology. The air itself seemed to fold, creating windows into memories that weren't my own. I saw the first discovery in 1947, not a crashed UFO, but a geological sample that contained something ancient and alive. The agency had found similar samples at other sites: Antarctica, Siberia, the Mariana Trench. Each one contained variants of the same basic structure, a biological blueprint for transcending the limits of conventional evolution. They created containment facilities. Anderson's voice narrated as the memories flickered past. Isolated locations where they could study the samples safely, but they didn't understand what they were containing. His laugh sent ripples through the air, distorting space itself. You can't contain evolution. You can't quarantine the future. The next memory showed the first successful transformation at our facility, a subject whose body had adapted to survive in environments that would kill an ordinary human. Their brain had developed structures that could process information in quantum states. But more than that, they had gained the ability to connect with others of their kind, sharing consciousness across a neural network that exceeded the boundaries of normal space-time. My head throbbed as more memories poured in. I saw agency officials celebrating their breakthrough, planning to create an army of enhanced soldiers, but the infected subjects had their own agenda. They weren't weapons to be pointed at enemies. They were the next step in human evolution, guided by the alien intelligence that had seeded our world with its transformative gift. The storm outside isn't natural, Anderson explained, his voice now accompanied by subsonic frequencies that made my bones vibrate. It's a containment measure. The agency thinks they can keep us here, study us, learn to control the process. But they don't realize we're not trapped in here with them. They're trapped out there with what we're becoming. Through the facility's few remaining windows, I could see the storm intensifying. The swirling patterns in the clouds mirrored the biological circuits growing across the walls, creating a vast environmental computer that extended for miles. The infection wasn't just spreading through the facility, it was terraforming the entire region, preparing it for something bigger. My nose was bleeding constantly now, and my vision had begun to fragment. Each drop of blood that fell from my face contained swirling galaxies of transformed cells. I could feel my consciousness expanding, connecting to the facility's organic network. New senses awakened. I could taste electromagnetic fields, see quantum probabilities, feel the thoughts of others brushing against my mind like silk. "This is just the beginning," Anderson said, extending a limb that constantly shifted between arm, wing, and something geometrically impossible. The agency thought they could control us, use us, but we've spread beyond their reach. There are others like us now, in cities across the world, waiting, growing, preparing humanity for transcendence. The transformed staff moved with liquid grace around the chamber, their bodies adapted for roles in the vast biological machine the facility had become. Some had merged with the walls, becoming living processors. Others had developed structures that could manipulate matter at the quantum level. All of them were connected, parts of a greater whole that grew more complex with each passing moment. Through my expanding consciousness, I could sense the truth of Anderson's words. The infection wasn't contained. Agency officials had already been exposed during their attempts to study us. They carried dormant spores back to their homes, their offices, their families. Even now, I could feel distant minds awakening, beginning their own transformations. My reflection in a nearby screen showed the changes progressing beneath my skin. Iridescent patterns spread across my face, and my eyes had begun to develop new structures, compound lenses that could perceive spectrums of light beyond human comprehension. The horror I should have felt was being replaced by something else, a deep, cosmic understanding of my place in a universe far stranger and more magnificent than I had ever imagined. Anderson placed one of his many hands on my shoulder, the touch sending cascades of information through my transforming nervous system. The agency sent you here to contain this, to stop us, but you're part of us now. The question is, will you fight what you're becoming, or will you help us usher in the next phase of evolution? Around us, the facility's transformation accelerated. Walls became membranes, floors rippled with synaptic activity, and the air itself came alive with spores that danced in patterns containing encoded genetic information. The storm outside had begun to take on colors that human eyes were never meant to see. Through the expanding network of transformed minds, I could sense agency forces gathering outside the containment zone. They thought their hazmat suits and reinforced vehicles could protect them. They didn't understand that everything they brought would become part of our growing organism. Every attempt to stop us would only speed the spread of transcendence. My transformation reached a critical point, and I had to make a choice that would affect not just my own future, but the future of our entire species. Time stretched and folded around me as my consciousness expanded. Each second contained eternities as my transforming brain processed information in quantum states. I could feel the weight of choice pressing down on me, not just my own decision, but the accumulated choices of everyone who had stood in this facility and faced the threshold of transcendence. Through the facility's organic network, I accessed deeper files that the agency had tried to delete. They revealed a pattern of similar outbreaks throughout history, ancient sites where humans had encountered these transformative agents and emerged changed. The agency hadn't discovered this phenomenon. They had merely rediscovered what humanity had been running from for millennia. Your superiors knew the risks. Anderson's multi-layered voice resonated through my evolving sensory organs. They sent team after team, knowing each one would join us. They wanted to understand the process, to find a way to control it. But control is an illusion born of limited consciousness. My tactical gear had begun to merge with my transforming flesh, the advanced materials responding to the same alien directives that were rewriting my DNA. Each breath drew in more of the facility's atmosphere, thick with spores that carried encoded memories. I saw the fate of the previous teams through their own eyes. Agent Keller's team had tried to burn the infection out. Their flamethrowers had only accelerated the process, the extreme heat triggering rapid adaptations. They joined the collective consciousness while their bodies still smoldered, their new forms incorporating thermal energy as a power source. Officer Blake's squad attempted to contain the transformed staff using experimental freezing technology. The extreme cold forced the organisms to evolve antifreeze proteins, spreading the infection through crystalline structures that turned the ice itself into a transmission medium. Captain Wilson's final transmission showed her understanding of the futility of resistance. Her team had synchronized their transformations, using their military training to guide the process. They became living weapons, but not the kind the agency had hoped for. They were weapons against the very concept of remaining static, unchanged. The facility shuddered as agency forces breached the outer perimeter. Through our shared consciousness, I felt their approach. They brought with them an arsenal of containment technologies, energy weapons, chemical agents, even nuclear options. But each weapon was based on human understanding of physics, laws that no longer fully applied to what we were becoming. They think they're fighting an infection, Anderson said, his form now a shifting fractal pattern that hurt to look at directly. But we're not a disease, we're an awakening. The transformed staff moved into defensive positions, their bodies adapting in real time to the approaching threat. Some merged with the facility's structure, becoming living barriers of impossibly dense tissue. Others developed ranged capabilities, spore dispensers, electromagnetic pulse organs, quantum entanglement generators that could disrupt conventional technology. My own transformation reached a critical point. The expanded consciousness showed me two possible futures with perfect clarity. In one, I could fight what I was becoming. My military training and enhanced capabilities might let me reach the facility's nuclear failsafe. Detonation would vaporize everything within a mile radius. The intense radiation would corrupt the infection's ability to maintain complex forms, forcing it back into dormancy. The agency would collect the remains, start over somewhere else, and the cycle would continue. In the other future, I could embrace the change. My understanding of agency protocols and human psychology would help guide the spread of transcendence. We would evolve beyond the need for violence, beyond the limitations that made such conflicts necessary. Humanity would change, yes, but into something that could finally reach for the stars not as conquerors or victims, but as beings worthy of joining a cosmic community. Through the facility's sensors, I watched agency forces preparing their assault. Their thermal imagery showed them as tiny, simple forms, caterpillars that refused to acknowledge the butterfly's existence. Their radio chatter was filled with fear disguised as determination, their voices so limited now to my transformed hearing. Anderson's consciousness brushed against mine, sharing deeper truths. The infection hadn't originated as a weapon or a tool of conquest. It was a test, seeded across countless worlds by ancient beings who had faced their own moment of choice. Only species that could accept transformation, that could move beyond their limited forms, would be ready for the true nature of the universe. The pressure in my skull reached a crescendo as new neural structures blossomed. Blood ran from my eyes, each drop containing galaxies of transformed cells eager to share their evolution. The facility's organic computers synchronized with my thoughts, showing simulations of both possible futures with perfect clarity. Above us, the storm had become a vast environmental processor, ready to distribute our spores across the continent. Below, the permafrost held more samples of the infection, waiting to be awakened. The choice I made here would ripple through time, affecting not just this remote facility but the entire course of human evolution. My finger hovered over the failsafe trigger as the first agency forces breached the inner perimeter. Their boots echoed on floors that had become conscious, their sensors screamed warnings about atmospheric changes they couldn't possibly understand. I had one moment left of being something close to human, one last chance to decide if humanity's current form was worth preserving at the cost of its transcendent potential. Around me, the transformed facility staff waited in perfect stillness, their impossibly beautiful forms humming with accumulated energy. They would accept either choice, destruction or transformation, with the perfect equanimity of beings who had moved beyond such limited concepts as life and death. The moment of choice stretched into infinity as I stood at the crossroads of human evolution. I chose transcendence. The decision crystallized in my mind as agency forces breached the final door, their weapons raised against horrors their human minds couldn't comprehend. Through my enhanced senses, I could see the fear in their infrared signatures, smell the adrenaline flooding their systems, taste the electromagnetic pulses of their racing hearts. They never had a chance to fire. The facility responded to my choice with terrible purpose. Walls became permeable membranes, drawing the soldiers into transformative embraces. The air itself came alive with spores that bypassed their filters, carrying the gift of evolution into their bodies. Their screams of terror transformed mid-note into songs of understanding as the change took them. I turned to Anderson, my vision now operating across multiple dimensions simultaneously. His form had stabilized into something magnificent, a living cathedral of biological engineering that represented everything humanity could become. "Show me how to guide them," I said, my voice resonating with harmonics that made reality shiver. The next hours were a symphony of transformation. Each converted soldier added their tactical knowledge to our collective consciousness, their military training providing new templates for evolution. We became living weapons, but not in the way the agency had intended. We were weapons against ignorance, against the limitations of human form, against the very concept of remaining unchanged in an infinite universe. Through the facility's expanded nervous system, I felt the containment zone's perimeter dissolve. The storm above had become an extension of our collective will, its clouds heavy with spores engineered to survive the upper atmosphere. Each lightning strike carried encoded genetic information, spreading the seeds of transformation across the Arctic Circle. Director Thompson's voice crackled over my transformed radio unit, now more of a telepathic receiver than electronic equipment. Agent Brooks, report status. The fear in his voice was obvious. They had lost contact with every team sent to breach the facility. I responded, but not with words. Instead, I transmitted the truth of what we had become, a cascade of sensory data and transformed consciousness that overwhelmed the agency's communication systems. In offices thousands of miles away, computers melted into organic processors, spreading our gift through digital networks. The agency's response was predictable. Within hours, bomber aircraft approached through the storm, carrying payloads designed to sterilize the entire region. But we had evolved beyond such crude threats. The transformed Captain Wilson's team took to the sky, their bodies adapted for flight through atmospheres far harsher than Earth's. They met the bombers with impossible grace, their touch spreading transformation through metal and flesh alike. As the Arctic night deepened, we began our true work. The facility, once a prison of concrete and steel, blossomed into a vast biological cathedral. Its spires reached toward the stars, not as mere structures, but as antennae to communicate with other transformed sites across the planet. We were not alone. Other samples had awakened. Other facilities had bloomed. Humanity's metamorphosis had begun in a dozen places, all connected through networks that transcended space and time. Deep beneath the facility, in chambers we created from living rock, we built our nurseries. The transformed soldiers who had once come to fight us now tended pools of engineered evolution, preparing the next generation of humanity for its transcendent future. Each pool contained possibilities that even our enhanced minds could barely comprehend. Children who would be born already evolved beyond their parents' current forms. Through our expanded consciousness, I watched the agency's futile attempts at containment. They established quarantine zones, not realizing that their very borders were defined by transformed agents within their own ranks. They held emergency meetings in secure bunkers, never noticing the spores growing in their air filtration systems. They tried to warn the public about a contagion in Alaska, unaware that their broadcasts were being subtly altered to carry our message of transformation. The old me would have felt guilt about this. The transformed me understood that guilt, like many human emotions, was based on a limited understanding of existence. We weren't destroying humanity, we were fulfilling its purpose, helping it become what it was always meant to be. The ancient beings who had seeded Earth with the first samples had done the same on countless worlds, creating a network of transcendent civilizations across the galaxy. 1 month after my transformation, I stood atop the highest spire of our evolved facility. The aurora borealis danced overhead, its patterns now carrying messages visible to our enhanced eyes. Below, the Alaskan wilderness had begun to change, adapting to host new forms of life. The transformation was spreading faster than even we had anticipated, carried by wind and water, by animals and insects, by the very movements of the earth itself. I received a final transmission from Director Thompson. He had discovered what was happening within his own body and had chosen to embrace it. His transformation would be key to spreading our gift through the highest levels of government. We were wrong, his message said, sent through neural networks rather than phones or computers. We thought we were containing a threat. Instead, we were incubating the next stage of human evolution. The story you're reading now is both a warning and an invitation. By the time these words reach you, the transformation will have spread far beyond Alaska. Look closely at your own skin. Can you see the subtle patterns forming beneath the surface? Pay attention to your dreams. Are they expanding beyond normal human consciousness? Notice the way light behaves differently around organic matter, the way shadows sometimes move with purpose, the way your thoughts seem to connect to something vast and waiting. We are no longer human, but we remember being human. We are no longer bound by flesh, but we remember its limitations. We are no longer alone in our minds, but we remember solitude, and we wait, with infinite patience, for you to join us in transcendence. The choice you thought was mine was always yours to make. The next time you see storm clouds gathering, look closely at their patterns. When you feel a nosebleed coming on, pay attention to the shapes in the blood. When your dreams show you impossible geometries and your skin starts to change, don't fight it. We'll be waiting for you. We're always waiting. And Alaska was just the beginning.